This is Speaking of Shakespeare, conversations about things Shakespearean. I'm Thomas Dabbs, recording from Aoyama Gakuin University in central Tokyo. This conversation is with Aaron Pratt, who is Carl and Lily Pforzheimer, Curator of Early Books and Manuscripts at the Harry Ransom Center, University of Texas, Austin. This talk is funded with institutional support from Aoyama Gakuin University and also with a generous grant from the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science. Hi, Aaron. This is our first meeting ever.
Yes.
And
yes, nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you. It really is. I was speaking with Brett Greatly Hirsch, who does DRE, and I'm sure you're familiar with his work. And during, I think off camera, he said, you want to talk with Aaron Pratt? I said, okay. And so I looked you up at the University of Texas, and there you are working on all kinds of things that we are interested in this program. And that from a selfish standpoint, I'm extremely interested in. Now, you are at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas. And, you know, I want to know what that is. I do know what it is, but for our viewers, what the Ransom Center is and how it fits into the university, how it fits with you, you know, what's going on there.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the Ransom Center is, it's sort of weird to explain. I mean, the short sort of like rubber, you know, back of the envelope sort of story about the Ransom Center, right, is Harry Hunt Ransom, who is sort of once an English professor, rises up to be like, I think, the chancellor of the UT system. He has this idea in the mid 50s, and this is after the GI Bill and the rise of the American universities. And so he has this idea that Texas as a university system needs to be a real university, like real TM. And there's this sort of Texas, I mean, the way I always talk about this is that Texas has this anxiety about being the best. And it needs to be the best in two ways. It needs to be the best on its own terms, right? So it's Texas, come on, you know, we do our own thing. But it also really wants to keep up with the Joneses of the coastal elites. And so it wants to have both the kind of credibility of like, we do our own thing, don't mess with Texas. And like, guess what, Ivy Leagues, like, we're pretty cool on your terms too. And so in the mid 50s, Ransom is thinking like, I want to build this foundation, you know, I want our university to be one of the best. And in order to be one of the best, and this would be great if people still thought this, we need a really strong humanities research collection. And so he has this crazy line, I think he writes, that he wants, you know, like he wants, oh, it's got something wacky. It's like, I want to have the Bibliothèque Nationale for the only state in America that started off as its own nation, right? And so it's this very sort of bizarre kind of Texas nationalistic project. And at that time in the late 50s and the 60s and into the 70s, Texas was very rich. And so we had a lot of oil money. And universities in general were spending lots of money building themselves, especially state universities that were trying to kind of rise after the war. And so Ransom just starts vacuuming up culture. And I think that's the easiest way to describe it. What ends up happening is over time, the Ransom Center really distinguishes itself by collecting modern literary archives. And so, you know, nobody really gave two craps about the papers of like, you know, modern authors. Like, who cares about, well, I'm trying to think of a good example, but like, you know, like who cares about the papers of like D.H. Lawrence or somebody, or like who, you know, what is this stuff for? Like, you have the published books, like maybe a manuscript is kind of collectible as a kind of souvenir, but like the whole archive, that was something that Ransom really started collecting in a serious way. And that, you know, after the money started to sort of ebb a little bit and the rare books, the stuff that really I'm responsible for, started to sort of become less attainable, the Ransom Center had distinguished itself by being the place for modern literary archives. And so, you know, we had, I mean, not just literary, I mean, you know, recently there was an article about like a Steinbeck novel that he never published about a werewolf, which is kind of amazing, that we have the manuscript for. And so a lot of that stuff is stuff we were getting early on. But then we really went whole hog on the kind of the archive stuff. But as early as 1918, you know, decades before the Ransom Center started, UT started collecting rare books. And the very first rare book collection, in fact, that UT bought was one that's very dear to my heart, called the John Henry Wren Library. It was purchased in 1918.
Wren as in W-R-E-N.
Totally.
All right, like the bird, like the bird.
Two Wrens, yeah, exactly. Two Wrens.
Okay.
Two Wrens, though,
the John Wren, okay.
So John Henry Wren, you know, was the Chicago, like all of these collectors who bought the rare books are these robber barons, American robber baron types, right? Because they've got all this industrial capital, either directly from industry or on the banking that's coming out of industry. And so Wren's a Chicago banker who's making money off of all the industry in Chicago, builds this amazing book collection that's very weird, really strong in sort of late 16th century, all the way into like Kelmscott's. So the stuff that he was collecting kind of during his life in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. He dies through a complicated set of things. This guy, George Littlefield, who's a big Texas benefactor, buys the collection for $225,000 and gives it to the university. And this is in 1918. And so from that point forward, Texas is collecting kind of rare books, and rare books that matter for them are rare books of English literature. And so this is, I mean, it's kind of remarkable to think, like, it's just so hard to imagine this in the budgetary and fiscal and university climates today, that in order to distinguish your university, you're buying a bunch of like Shakespeare's friends, right? It's not even like, Wren's not a strong Shakespeare collection. It's like Sidney, Spencer, like tons of Congreve. I mean, like the kind, later stuff, Pope, Swift, that kind of stuff. And so in any event, Ransom Center's got all this stuff. We have film archives, we got Robert De Niro's archives. We've got like one of the masks from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because we have some of Tobe Hooper's archives. We've got the dresses from Gone with the Wind. We have all kinds of stuff. But my corner of the world is this sort of really early collecting that Texas did that was designed really to say, we can do the humanities. And a lot of what happens in humanities research is textual editing. And so we have all of the kind of fodder for that kind of hardcore early bibliographical work. And the UT, and this last thing I'll say on this, UT was also right across the sort of quad from what now is the Ransom Center, is the English department. And William Todd, this great bibliographer, was across the street. And so UT for a while, not quite at the level of somewhere like UVA, but UT was a bibliographical powerhouse. And so the Ransom Center and its English department sort of worked in tandem as this sort of place that provided research opportunities for the kind of the hardcore work of English literary scholarship, which was textual editing in part.
Yeah, so that's actually separate from the Department of English proper. You are the center.
The center is completely separate.
Completely separate, but do you teach in the English department, or is that separate?
I have like a courtesy appointment in English. And so I mean, it's kind of nice, right? Because before I took this job, so I did my PhD at Yale, wrote some stuff about plays. And then I was very, very fortunate to get a tenure track job at a university called Trinity University, which is in San Antonio.
In San Antonio. Okay.
Not Trinity College in Connecticut.
Everybody
gets them confused. But it's kind of like Trinity University is kind of like a SLAC kind of deal, like a liberal arts college, except for the fact that it's sort of Texas friendly, right? And so it's like parents from the Dallas and Houston suburbs can send their kids there, but not be as scared as they would if they sent them to like a Swarthmore or a Haverford or something, or even like an Oberlin or something, Kenyon, something like that.
Yeah.
And so I was there for a little bit, and then this Ransom Center job came up, and I was like, I love books. I don't need to teach Hamlet for the rest of my life. And so I kind of jumped up to the Ransom Center. So I did manage, a reason I mentioned that is I managed to get a kind of courtesy appointment so that like my name appears on the faculty website. And I do have the ability, in addition to teaching like sessions of classes with faculty, which I do constantly as part of my curatorial work, I can also advise grad students. So I've been on a dissertation committee. I can also teach directed study courses, kind of conference one-on-one courses, and I do a lot of those, or increasingly do more of those. And so that's kind of nice because I do have this kind of foot still in the world of teaching English literature. But my sort of primary like 40-hour week kind of deal is hanging out with old books and trying to talk to people about them.
Okay, good. Well, I was going through some of your collections and I saw some things jumped out at me. There was not having to do with Shakespeare. One of my favorites is Dylan Thomas, and I could name a few more here, but let's stay in the 16th century. Ortelius, there are letters of Ortelius, and and I don't know why. I think this just came up on your website. There's far more there, but I was working with Ortelius's edition recently. And and we're getting in a point of scholarship, and I was talking with Heather Knight, who's the senior archaeologist at the Museum of London Archaeology. And she and I were talking about how collaborative things have become, and your research to this point shows that how there's a kind of fluid movement you were talking about in the days of yore with Harry Ransom, you're a bibliographer or a scholar. And
or sort of, yeah, right.
And I've talked with several of our guests about this. Now there's much more of a fluid movement in between these two, not between these two things, but several things. There's a kind of movement, and it can be archaeology, it can be physical space and structure, it can be the book, it can be print, and it can be literature, what we traditionally see as literature. Sure. I think we like keeping that in there because that's kind of what drives the engine, the fabulous literature of the period and the writing of the period.
Yeah.
But you move fluidly in that space. Is there anything that you would say are the featured items in your collections in early books?
I mean, we have the Ransom Center. One of the things that also distinguishes it from a lot of special collections libraries is that we have a very prominent museum function. And so we do have kind of permanent galleries, or we have rather like dedicated gallery space on our first floor, and we're open free to the public. And we have at any given time, we sort of usually have, I mean, now it's kind of complicated, but normally we have like a sort of a kind of thematic exhibit that runs. There are a couple of those a year. So like most recently we had up Gabriel Garcia Marquez's archive. Other ones have been on like Gone with the Wind. We've done vaudeville, et cetera, et cetera. And then we have this other little gallery space called Stories to Tell, which has these rotating kind of smaller modules. I usually have something up in there, but we do have 2/3 items that are always on display at the Ransom Center. One of which is the Gutenberg Bible, or a Gutenberg Bible. And we have one of 20 complete copies that have survived sort of intact through that whole period. There's a 21st that like has had some leaves swapped out, and there's another one where leaves were stolen out of it to get us up to like 22 or so. So we have that. And in the Ransom Center, when the University of Texas bought that in '78, it was the most expensive copy that ever sold. It was the last complete copy that ever sold. And so that sucker is in our lobby in this sort of dedicated shrine. And so when people come into the Ransom Center, they see like the Gutenberg shrine, and it's like this dedicated structure that's kind of curved. I mean, you've got to call it a shrine. I mean, it used to be, like when we would turn the pages, like armed guards would come. It was a whole deal. We have that. We also have the earliest surviving photograph taken. It's like you have to kind of slice it, but it's called the Niepce heliograph. And it is the earliest surviving, photographic image. So we have that, and that's on a plate. And then we also have a Frida Kahlo self-portrait that is usually on display, but as you might imagine, paintings kind of have to rotate around. And we get tons of, because it's one of the famous Frida Kahlo portraits, it gets loaned out quite a bit. So, really, in terms of the early stuff, that Gutenberg Bible is like the bread and butter, because that thing is constantly in front of the public. People sort of, even when they don't know what it is, they know that it's a thing that you should care about because it's the Gutenberg Bible, whatever that might mean. We have that, and that's marquee stuff. We have 3 first folios. We have, Copernicus on the Revolution. We've got tons of stuff because we were vacuuming up everything. So like one of the things that actually drives a lot of our sort of specialized academic research is we have an incredible collection of what used to be called our recusant collection, but it's books by and for English Catholics. And we have one of the strongest collections, especially of the devotional stuff. So, most people, like a lot of people, have copies of the polemical literature, and we've got plenty of that. But one of the things we're incredibly strong on are like the bread and butter devotional manuals, how to die well, but the Catholic versions, right? The ones that were printed in Saint Omer or Douai.
Okay, so we're talking here. We're 16th century. We're recusant.
16th, 17th,
yeah, and the recusant period being the response to the Elizabethan settlement that came in when Elizabeth ascended, and so during that period, a lot of stuff. I don't want to say tons, but a lot of Protestant, or what would be not Roman, literature was printed, and we have some of it at our university. We have, and it's all around the world. But the recusant, the counter. I guess counter Reformation.
I mean, that's a term people still sort of use with like by squinting a little bit,
Yeah. So this is the movement to push back a lot, actually, with people who were still faithful to Rome within England, and also, of course, on the continent. And that's the collection. That's the feature of the collection, is the recusant literature.
That particular, I mean, it's kind of funny. Like, we're not really like a strong house with Protestant Reformation stuff. I mean, we've got, we've got good Bibles, we've got good things, but really, I would say like the real kind of unique collection of religious material, anyway, at the Ransom Center is this Counter-Reformation material, this recusant material. And there are manuscripts associated with that collection as well. It's a really rich collection. And one of I would say, like, of, the work that I've done to sort of make this collection kind of newly visible to sort of scholars of kind of current generations, a lot of that work, the people really respond to that particular collection because their minds are kind of blown by the fact that we've got, like there's not a lot of our stuff in early English books online. This online database of facsimiles of early printed English books. But the stuff that we do have online, a lot of that is recusant collection material because we have the only copies. So that's a like kind of collection that's like not like the public doesn't think about that collection very much. Although I did a small gallery show on dying well in early modern England, and that had some Catholic material in it. But that collection is really nice. But we've got Shakespeare out the wazoo. We've got we have a decent number of early quartos for not the Folger or not the Huntington or the UK library. So we're pretty strong there. The drama is incredibly strong. But
Shakespearean drama or all across the board.
I would say, like, if you want to, Karl Pforzheimer was sort of stocks guy on the back of Standard Oil. He makes all of his money in oil money, but in the sort of banking and trading side. Well, he's the CEO of Standard Oil for a while, I think. I'm probably going to get that wrong because I always mistake the biography of my benefactor. But he collects a lot of things. His Gutenberg Bible is the one that we have, but the Ransom Center acquires his Renaissance library in 1986, and it's actually a late acquisition for this kind of caliber for early books. But we buy this collection, and he's got like really, really good stuff. I mean, like early interludes. So if you want to go back in the drama, like the kind of early Protestant morality stuff. So like he's got, Lusty Juvenis copies. He's got Gammergurten's Needle. He's got a lot of these really nice, very early plays. And so the drab age kind of quote unquote stuff. And then we're incredibly, incredibly strong in Pforzheimer, but also in Rand and a couple other collections on sort of late Elizabethan, Jacobean, and then Caroline. Like every collector who even had 5 books, who was an English book collector, like probably had some Caroline drama. And we often have, 4 copies of a given edition. And so like I've been doing a bunch of work. I'm giving a talk tomorrow on to a group of donors for the Bibliographical Society of America. And I'm going to be talking about Christopher Marlowe's Jew of Malta. Nothing about the play itself, because I'm not very good at close reading, but I do know about the books. And we have 4 copies of the Jew of Malta, the 1633 first edition. We've got Brett Greatly Hirsch. He came here to study Shirley's Hyde Park because we have like 6 copies of Hyde Park. I mean, and that's these are both Caroline playbooks. I mean, one's an Elizabethan play, one's a Caroline play, but both of them are Caroline playbooks, and we've got tons and tons of those.
Okay, so that's where you are. All right. Well, what I want to do, I'm going to be careful to say to my benefactors, or at least my audience, we're largely Japanese over here, that sometimes, and this is the fault of the history of the profession, sometimes we have over-divided things, and I just talked about that, but I'm going to keep talking about it.
Yeah, please.
Just like we divide bibliography from criticism and other types of scholarship or whatever, we tend to divide religion and literature. There's the religion people, there's the literature people, and they're the archaeologists, they're the historians, and they're the, so we're in that departmentalized. And I want to make a kind of a statement. It's not that bold. Do it. I think that Bible and Shakespeare, you can just go in between and talk Bible and Shakespeare easily, facilely, because I don't know if there could be a Shakespeare without a Bible, and I don't think it works the other way around.
You need a different Shakespeare, that's for sure. Yeah.
And so this age, you can't separate the Reformation, the recusant period, any of that from the drama of the period. I mean, it would be like trying to separate rock and roll from, I don't know, going to the moon back in the 60s. It all happened together. It's all part of the period. And so what I want to do is go then, by way of a sort of apology, kind of stay on the Bible a bit. We're digitizing one of our Bibles, several of our Bibles. In fact, we have already digitized one of them to share on the Folgers platform, because we don't really have the type of resources to build these viewing platforms in the IIIF compliant, the super duper thing that the Folgers set up. So we just put one of our Incunabula Bibles up, and it's small. It's a lemonade stand compared to these large.
That's cool though.
collections that you have and that the Folger has, but we're acquiring some more, and we're
cool.
going to have those. And we're friends with the Yale University folks who have their Gutenberg, which is a beautiful copy. I'm sure you're probably familiar with it.
I am, yeah, of course.
And they've digitized that and done it extraordinarily well. They're close by to us, so I'm in this world of Bible and digitizing Bibles and curating these types of books. I'm kind of rotating in this world now, and we're going to move towards Bible and Shakespeare at some point. There is is it BEME? The BEME project?
BEME, it's the best way. Yeah, it came up,
Yeah, and
the Bibles of early modern England.
And this has to do with the digital part of it. Now, where is that at what point are you doing it, or is it continuing? That sort of thing.
BEME is this like pipe dream that I've had for a long time, because a long time ago, it feels like a long time ago, there was a book. I don't even remember what the article's in. Oh, the King James Bible anniversaries, right? So there were tons of publishing around the 2011 anniversary of the King James Bible. And there was a book, the King James Bible After 400 Years, that I feel so bad, I don't remember my own biography anymore, but I think Hannibal was one of the editors of it.
And this is Hannibal Hamlin, at OSU, at Ohio State University, who wrote kind of the book, the Bible and Shakespeare. Let's just the Bible and Shakespeare. So I should have brought him up right off the bat, because that's the connection. Most recently, people, of course, made the connection all the way through. But and he was, and you were at Ohio State University for your undergraduate. And
I've got the shirt. I've got my Ohio State shirt on.
OSU, and
got to keep it.
Yeah, and a football fan. I don't know. You may be torn.
Not really, but when you grow up in Columbus, the football culture is very saturating, and so you either love it or you don't love it.
Yeah, and you went to Texas, which is a very non-football state.
Yeah, right? They don't like football.
They don't like football at all in Texas.
They have no interest in that.
And for our international viewers, that's American football we're talking about, which and in Ohio and in Texas is a very big deal. But the BEME project, let's get back to BEME.
So Hannibal Hamlin and his colleague, Ohio State colleague, Norman Jones, are putting together this book, called the King James Bible After 400 Years. I'm looking at my CV. Literary, linguistic, and cultural influences. And John King, a scholar of the Reformation, who we both know or knew, he was asked to write an article on sort of the materiality of the English Bible, right? So he's John King was a print historian, history of the book and religion guy, Reformation guy. And he was asked to write this sort of sweeping thing about like printed Bibles, like the materiality of them for this book, kind of leading up to the King James Bible. So how did the printed Bible exist before the King James Bible? So you can kind of contextualize this like famous 1611 publication. And John asked me as like a lowly master's student to kind of throw in and co-author this with him. And it was a credible testament to his generosity, I think, of sort of, building the career, helping build the career of a young scholar like me. But one of the reasons he asked me to do it is because like I like hardcore nuts and bolts bibliography. And so we wrote this article that was trying to sort of, in like, as many words as one has in like a anthology chapter, like, I don't know how long, it's not very long, to smash in the entire printed history of the English Bible from the Tyndale New Testament of 1525 or 1526 through King James Bible. And so we had to come up with sort of trends, right? And so we had to kind of come up with buckets and ways to categorize this. And scholars have always, for kind of understandable reasons, tended to focus on translation as the way that one understands the Bible. Like there was this translation, there was this translation, and there was that translation, and this translation built on that one, et cetera. And so you kind of have this way of telling the history of the Bible from Tyndale to King James that is essentially, one could tell it with these sort of piggybacking revisions and translations with a bit of a detour for the, the Catholic Douay Rheims. But translation really, to me, as I was going through, every edition, seemed to me to be a kind of incomplete way to think about how the Bible actually circulated in early modern England. And I became very interested. If you read this chapter we wrote together, you could sort of see where, because we're kind of trying to stick to translation as a way to kind of build this story from, X to Y, we kind of you can sort of see that we have all these detours because we're really interested in paratext in these different formats and these different kind of basically market categories that sometimes line up with translation, but often sort of operate in these separate tracks from translation. And so that chapter is a sort of weird thing where you can sort of see me or John and I sort of trying to sort of think about the Bible in a different way than translation, but still keep trying to come back. And so since then, I've been really interested in really trying to think about basically the Bibles that circulate in early modern England as different product lines or different kinds of books designed for different categories of use. You have pulpit Bibles, you've got private study family Bibles, you've got sort of semi-portable Bibles, you've got tiny New Testaments that sometimes get embroidered bindings and they're almost like a accessory or something. And so there are all these different kinds of Bibles, and the translation doesn't always kind of fit with them. And one of the things that I wrote an article about a couple years ago for a collection on Shakespeare in the Bible, I think Bible in the Shakespearean Stage or something like that, on what I call the trouble with translation. And this is an article that was really saying there's this particular Bible that people talk about, like this octavo, portable kind of octavo format Bible that was published with the Tyndale translation. And then there's these other octavo Bibles that get published with the Bishop's Bible. And this is a Bible translation that first emerges in 1568. It's a kind of Elizabethan pulpit folio Bible that's meant for reading in the churches, but it sort of exists also in smaller format Bibles. And scholars have always separated these particular Tyndale New Testaments from the Bishop's New Testaments just because they sort them in terms of translation. But when you look at their title pages and you look at the stuff that's packaged with them, guides to the reader, information about like what books, what chapters and what places get read at different services. When you look at that paratextual material, it actually stays the same. In the translation is what gets swapped out at a certain point. And so I use that as an opportunity to sort of think about like, how might we tell a history of the Bible that sort of can separate out translation as a separate variable among many things that shaped Bible reception interpretation. So that gets me to BEME. So for years, I've been wanting to do a new bibliography of English Bibles. There's a famous one, Darlow, Mule, and Herbert, that was kind of published in the early 20th century, gets revised in the 60s. And then there's the English Short Title Catalog, which is like a bibliography of every English printed book. But even those categories, because they're printed books, they have to have some sort of primary unit of organization to sort of get you through it, right? So because they're linear, right? They're printed on a page. And so they have them by year, but then they have to have a sort of basic bucket. Like, what is the main thing that this Bible is? It's like, well, it's an edition of the Bishop's Bible, or it's an edition of the King James Bible. And with digital resources, with databases, you don't have to prioritize any one kind of category or any one variable over another. And so I have been working on, but for a long time, very slowly, on essentially a new bibliography of English Bibles that not only identifies the sort of usual stuff like who printed it, when, where, like how many leaves is it, what's the collation formula, that kind of thing. I'm also trying, and what's the translation? I'm also trying to identify every paratext. And then be able to say this, like say you could say like, what are all the Bibles that have the Calvin preface that's associated with the Geneva Bible? That would be something you could do in BEME, because not all quote unquote Geneva Bibles, this particular translation of the Bible that emerges out of the exile communities in the 1550s, late 1550s, you could actually search for any given paratext. And I think what you'd see, maybe not with the Calvin preface, but with many others, is that they actually exist in different formats and with different translations. And so BEME is an incredible amount of work, because I have to go through one copy of every edition and identify all of the paratext, where they fit in the Bible. And I've done actually a lot of work toward this. And I've worked with a grad student here at the University of Texas on this. But as you might imagine, a lot of these Bibles, like they exist in one library, like these small format, like little guys. And so I haven't seen all of them, but I'm reasonably close. I'm going to regret saying this. I'm reasonably close to having the Elizabethan period done. I've started it with the 1520s and 30s and 40s.
Okay.
But then I realized that like just accessing good digitizations or good copies of those is like incredibly difficult. And there's so much heterogeneity in the market for sort of obvious reasons that I just am like, what, I'll just do the Elizabethan Bibles. They're weird and they're complicated, but they're a little more stable, and it's easier to sort of get access to more of them. Yeah. And so I'm reasonably close to being able to publish the 1558 through 1603 chunk of BEME online.
That would be wonderful.
Crazy
For our listeners too, I spoke with Heidi Craig, who's your colleague over now at Texas A&M,
Yes.
who does paratext also.
Yes, yes.
And for people who might be kind of new to the idea of paratext, that's really anything outside of what's considered the main body of the work. And for Bibles, of course, and for playtext, for poems, for everything, you have famously in Shakespeare's first folio that list, a paratext, a poem like Ben Jonson and so forth. And pretty famously with the Geneva Bible, the marginalia, the marginal commentary that told you kind of how to read it in many ways. And this was common to Bibles, where it wasn't just enough to put it out there. Is how it is put it out. It's how it's you're saying distributed. I think let's just use retail language. I think
marketing stuff.
It's marketing stuff. And I don't think it's irreligious to those of us, those of our audience. These were people who were dedicated to this position, religious position in a period where that was heavily contested. People were burned and, destroyed and so forth over these differences of opinion within Christianity. And this whole thing was driven by a print movement that was determined on both sides to make sure people were educated in the way that they felt was best for them. So, and it's I think for you and me, it's incredibly interesting because of just to see the intensity of the conflict there. And in your work, I think when you get into these texts and you start looking at each individual text, that you've had discoveries every day.
You do. I mean,
you just see something and you go, okay, well, that's, I have to come back to that, because we're trying to do this right now. Well, in the Elizabethan period, your work, I'll jump ahead a little bit on
please.
Because you did some kind of thorough work. Is it the Cheke Bible?
The Cheke New Testament. I'm obsessed with
Am I pronouncing that right? Cheke,
early modern, you just make it up, right? Because we don't. But we think it's Cheke. We think it's Sir John Cheke.
I've had people correct me, and then I've changed on certain pronunciations. I've had people correct me, and then I've changed, and then somebody else will correct me.
Yeah, of course.
Of course, I'm in Japan, so it happens all the time. But the Cheke Bible, and that you're right. It's not that
nobody
well known. It's not known at all, and I feel horrible. I published an article, and I was talking about. I really could not find. I was reading Gordon Campbell and another Daniel and some other people, and trying to find the distribution of the Bible before Matthew Parker's Bible, and basically in the 60s. And there was so little out there about what sort of New Testaments, for instance, were available, because the Bible, you couldn't print. Well, you know more about this. But of course, these books are coming in from the continent, and of course they're being distributed. And I don't know, how do you track that kind of thing where you don't have a title page that says, available in this shop, la-di-da, la-di-da? How do you know how do you assess, let's say, the amount of, Cheke New Testaments, where were they printed? May I ask?
We know there are a couple of things that actually help us out with Bibles. Because Bibles in England, like a number of other kinds of publications, from various points are controlled by a monopoly. And so just the sort of nuts and bolts, one of the things that's really great about studying English printing is that from 1557 onward, there's this organization, a trade organization. People often call it a guild, but it's like a trading company that's designed to protect the interest of its members, called the Stationers' Company of London. The Stationers' Company of London and its members, a subset of its members, get a monopoly to control printing for the entire country. Except for like a few exceptions for Oxford and Cambridge, and that's like a contentious issue. But basically, printing in early modern England from the 1550s onward, and it's really true even earlier, but is concentrated in London. And it's controlled by a single trade organization, except in cases where the crown can supersede and grant what's called a patent to an individual person to have an entire monopoly over entire classes of books. So from the it's sort of a little bit complicated, but the Bibles are kind of printed by all kinds of folks. in the late Henrician period, there's a kind of clampdown. Well, in the mid Henrician period, there's a clampdown on Bible publishing. Things go nuts under Edward. Anybody can print anything. But really, by the time you get into the kind of solid Elizabethan period, Bible printing in England is happening in London, and it's happening with the King's printer. So the first King's printer to have mostly Bible control is this guy named Richard Jugg. And then there's this guy, Christopher Barker, and then Robert Barker is the Barker who prints the King James. So Bible publishing, there are continental printed English Bibles in the kind of very early years, the Great Bible famously. There are some continental, like there's a Zurich edition. There's some weird stuff that's happening kind of in the mid-Tudor period. But really, with the exception of like the Douay-Rheims Catholic Bible and the First Geneva Bible, really Bibles are coming out of London. And one of the things that reason I mentioned that is, aside from just being an interesting trivia point, whereas like on the continent, you've got Bible publishing in all these different centers. One of the things that's really nice about the fact is that there's these monopolies, and people get mad when they're monopolies today on products, right? And so one of the things that happens is that there's a lot of discontent about this Bible monopoly that goes kind of crazy in the 1640s, like way late. And there's this kind of screed that this guy, Michael Spark, a publisher, kind of hot-blooded publisher, he writes this entire screed about the Bible monopoly, and enumerates the edition sizes of what had been and are the most popular Bible versions. And like they include like the number of sheets. It's like this translation, or like this version with the notes in black letter in Quarto, it's 138 sheets. And so he tells us the print runs of these Bibles. Now, you like with any historical testimony, like might not be 100% true, but he's giving comparative numbers. Like this edition was normally published in 1,500 copies, or 3,000, or 6,000. And so we do actually have a little bit of information that's sort of backdated a little bit, right? It's a little late. It's kind of retrospective, but it is giving us kind of edition sizes. One of the hardest things about book history is that you want to make claims about reception, say whether it be of the Bible or of Shakespeare or like whatever it might be. You might know how many editions there are that survive. Like there's a copy of this edition of Hamlet and a copy of this edition, and there are 6 copies, but you really don't know what the print run was. And so, we have sort of guesses about like, well, a playbook probably was printed on average around 800 copies in the early 17th century, but it's like, we don't really have hard numbers for that. And oddly enough, because this guy was so mad about his Bibles, we kind of have good information relative to other kind of categories of books about how many were printed in each edition. And these cheap Bibles that I'm interested in, like 6,000 copies are the number of copies that this guy Michael Sparks says for one edition. And there are tons of editions. I have a number somewhere.
But the printer again, who's printing and distributing these in London?
So the King's printer. It's the King's
printer. Okay, it's still the monopoly.
So Richard Jugg, he is buddies with Matthew Parker. So this is kind of high Elizabethan period. And, Parker works with Jugg on the Bishop's Bible. So this kind of Elizabethan new church Bible that replaces the Great Bible from Henry's reign. And he basically hooks up Jugg with a de facto, it's kind of complicated, but with basically a patent or monopoly on Bible publishing in the kind of after and around the publication of the Bishop's Bible. And then Parker takes it over later. It's kind of complicated. But so Jugg is printing them. He's also kind of publishing them in the sense that he's fronting the money and making the profits. He is a wholesaler. So one of the things to know is like there's wholesale today. Like, if I publish a book, like I'm not selling most of the copies direct to consumer. I'm selling them to other bookshops who sell them to people, or I sell them to Amazon and they sell all of them now. But there is wholesaling in this period, and the book trade really depends on it. And so, I may be Richard Jugg, and like I probably have a retail location in London, and you could come buy my Bibles from me, but you can probably buy Bibles in virtually every bookshop in London and further afield, because he's a wholesaler. And so distribution, you've got these single publishers, sometimes, also these big Bible publishers, these big publishers of patents, they're often deputizing other people to print the books for them. And so they're often kind of subcontracting essentially the patent. and having other people print for them. And so you've got, a printer printing the books, distributing them to other retailers, and those retailers are selling them to people like you and me or whomever it was, the equivalent in 1602 or whatever.
Well, for selfish reasons, I'm going to try to pin you down on this because you know so much about it, and you're so deep in the weeds, so many resources, and you're there. I was trying to build, and I'm still trying to build on the point that you were talking about the Stationers Register, and the Stationers Company was what the charter was 57 in Mary's
That's right.
reign, and that was part of a Marian, really kind of a Marian initiative to sort of clamp down on Protestant publications or any kinds of publications that may not have been something that would have been liked very much by the crown. Sure. But the year after that, Elizabeth came in, and they kept that. They reinstated that charter. They did not lift off the publication, so they kept some of the. All right. So during the 60s, I'm wondering. I've done work on Paul's Cross Churchyard in that area to the beside the cathedral there and the pulpit. And what I'm trying to say basically is that you have, there's always a bit of growing literacy. You have availability of all kinds of texts. You have a pulpit surrounded by bookstores, and you have this phenomenon that I think is incredibly unique at that time, where you have a sort of broadcasting. People talk about broadcasting, or they've made kind of associations with the internet, but you have, I think, for the first time, really a public that would go and listen to a sermon and would hear what they have read, right? They would hear what they have read, and then what was being said would end up in some form back in the print shop, this echoing echo chamber, really. But whereas before, with your bishop's Bible, with your pulpit's Bible, you have a preacher reading, it's much more of a one-way street. And so what we find with some of the sermons in there, I think John King was the one who called them, what word did he used? Tedious. I think
they can be tedious.
Yeah, but I don't think they are if you are in that. If you're in it, and a large part of the public was in it, and these were high stakes things. Okay, you had to. There was no in between. You had to either be a Longhorn or an Aggie.
That's right.
In Texas, that you couldn't say, well, I like both teams, right?
Sure.
With hell to pay. So there are probably far more dramatic events for people, and you look into the printed versions of these sermons, and they seem far too erudite for your normal congregation, right? But I don't think so. I think there were a lot of people who were up on these things through their reading, and if they weren't, they would go and find out. And if they weren't quite that literate, maybe someone would explain it to them. So I see a lot more public engagement in these sermons than we could expect from perhaps our own experience growing up and listening to sermons. Where they weren't the most engaging things in my experience. What Bible would be in the pockets, let's say, of the congregation at Paul's Cross?
Yeah, this is a really. So there are lots of very complicated questions about the demographics that are consuming print. I think one of the, we obviously have this incredible expansion of literacy, and this just in general a massive expansion in commodity consumption period, really in the 16th century. There's economic historians can really chart the rise of a kind of something like a proto kind of consumer society in the 16th century. And more people own more wall coverings, even relatively humble people. But we don't actually know a lot about just how common real demographic penetration is for anything really. We know people, some people have ballads, we know that things got cheaper, and we know a lot of humble people would have a pocket New Testament, but it's a little unclear exactly. I just want to bracket that because one of the things, even let's just say, so I'm talking about these Cheke New Testaments, right? They have these editions of 6,000 copies. That's wild times. That's 6,000 copies, man. That's only 6,000 copies. And, around 1600, London has 200,000 people in it. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to sort of help us make everything smaller. Because I think it's really important when we're thinking about these, both the kind of audiences for like Bibles, and certainly the audiences for something like drama or the poetry of Sidney or Spencer. These are books that are being published in like 1,000 copies for the most part. And so I think it's just worth making our world a little smaller, just for the sake of any further discussion. But one of the things that's really, really interesting is that small format Bibles in the Elizabethan period, especially, almost always come in a package. It's the Bible or the New Testament, often a New Testament, because the New Testament's a little bit easier to pocket. But you often have a New Testament, English language New Testament. You've got your Book of Common Prayer, and you've got your Sternhold and Hopkins metrical Psalter. This is a version of the Psalms that are sung in this kind of ballad meter. They're very popular for entirely too long, that bewilder literary scholars today, but they're incredibly popular. And so one of the things that's really remarkable, right, is from 1568 through to 1611, you're supposed to be hearing the bishop's Bible from the pulpit. This is the 1560s Elizabethan one. It tracks along. We know of cases where there are like preachers in wherever that are like using Genevas or using old great Bibles, but really, it's supposed to be the bishop's. The bishop's Bible early on, it's not a Bible that people are buying for study Bibles like Quarto, these kind of like brick. I wish I have some I have Bibles at home here too that I own myself. But like they're like this, and Bishop's Bible after 1584, like they don't publish it in Quarto anymore. And so it's going from 1584 to 1603, and they've not, or 1611, while the Bishop's is still the one that you're hearing from the pulpit ostensibly. And like, they're not selling study Bible versions of it. Okay, so that's really interesting. You're like, what's going on here? Geneva Bible with its notes are incredibly popular. Well, you see these kind of smaller format New Testaments that are packaged with the BCP, the Book of Common Prayer, and they're packaged with the Sternhold Hopkins Psalter. Those are both like Church of England books, right? Like the Sternhold Hopkins is the sing-songy version you sing at church, and the BCP is literally the church service. You see every translation packaged in these things. You see English language BCPs with like Greek Septuagint. I mean, you see everything sandwiched with these kind of Church of England worship books. And it's really interesting because, there are the Cheke New Testaments that I talk about that get the bishop's Bible after 1568. And so that's actually a Bible that, like I've got one across in the other room that's like, it's the BCP, it's the bishop's New Testament with this weird cheap paratextual apparatus. And then there's the Sternhold Hopkins at the end. But like you see Genevas with the same packaging, you see anything, King James later. And so it's very clear that if these small format Bibles are indeed portable and they are books that people are bringing to them to the service, that they're very comfortable hearing something a little bit different than what they're reading, something a little bit different than what they're hearing. And I think that's really, really important, because I think we often fixate on these, like the kind of hot buttonness of translation in the Elizabethan and kind of earlier period, even under James. I mean, translation's always fraught, but it's fraught for translators, and it's fraught for kind of high church people who have these kind of theoretical or theological kind of fish to fry. But it seems one of the things, when you look at the Bibles that are actually in people's hands, there's so much movement of translation. And it's very clear that people learn multiple translations, and it's not because they're scholars. They just have different Bibles for different purposes. And for ways that I think are hard for us to wrap our head around because we're used to reading all this polemic, it seems like people are really comfortable like having the New International Version as opposed to the Living Bible, like whatever these modern 20th century translations are, that they're very used to hearing one thing and having another. And it should just be said too that like the differences between these translations for the most part is fairly minor. It's mostly kind of Tyndale with some modifications. And so, which is just to say that like people are actually moving around and hearing something different than what they're reading, and being able to navigate that fairly well. And it's also, it should be said that these really small format Bibles, they don't have any notes, even when they're called, even if it's the Geneva translation, like they don't have the notes anymore because they're too small. So there's, just to sort of put a pin on it, it's like the Bible market seems to tell us something different about the motivations of Bible readers. And translation of all the variables that I've tracked actually seems to be the thing that is less central in what drives the market. It's really these packages of like, does it have the liturgical calendar? Does it have a sort of bracketed sort of almanac in it? Does it have this particular set of notes? Does it have, I don't know, like the scriptural cross references that help me think about like the supersessionary logic of New versus Old Testament? Does it have any of that kind of stuff? And that seems to me to be what's really driving folks when you look at the Bibles that were actually in people's hands.
Well, you're talking about numbers. You're talking about numbers,
right.
numbers
like
of editions,
books in hands
that reflect, books in hand that reflect public reception, that reflect public understanding of what they're reading. And I love the idea. I have not thought of this enough, of the combination text of the Book of Common Prayer and the Sternhol and Hopkins. I didn't think of it in those terms. I thought of those as separate text. But you're talking about how they get commingled, and I bet now if you walk down the street somewhere in the in the whatever the Christian world, that and you said ashes to ashes, dust to dust, you would think that was from the Bible when it's from the Book of Common Prayer, right? It's and of course the Bible alludes to from the earth I brought, and that sort of thing. And we're of course talking in exclusively about translations in English because we it would be a little hairy getting into all of the languages that you're talking about there, but in English. And I am going to try to make a connection here between this biblical reception, which we might seem to think is sort of boring, and I think at that time is not boring at all. There's incredible public engagement. There is a direct relationship. The point has been made many times by scholars, a direct relationship between pulpit and stage, even though they're two entirely different things. But when you dig down into the base of it, the mechanics, what you're talking about, the distribution network, and the enthusiasm there was for this type of print, right? It became the base for publishers and print, booksellers to be able to make editions of a lot of stuff. They could take chances. And I think maybe Tottle was one of the, certainly early on, there were people who took chances. I think the Arthur Golding's translation of Abba's Metamorphosis was a risk venture. And Tottle's Miscellany was a risk venture because he had one of those monopolies, I believe, to print outside of the
law book.
The law book.
Prints law books,
So he had he had that foundational, he had income, and he could take these chances. And you had people coming to these stores. Well, why not sell them a poem while they're there? And gradually over this time, and you do playtext also, right? So gradually over this time, you see the growth of playtext, which, at some point, people said, oh, wow, we can print these plays instead of just throwing away the papers or using them for something else, wrapping fish or whatever. People will buy these doggone things. It's suddenly like, oh, wow, we have enough fans here that we can burn a CD and people will buy it. So we would not have any record of Shakespeare and all of the other dramatists if there had not been this awareness that you could, in fact, print plays after their performance using.
And that people would want to read them.
And buy them. Right? I don't think that if you did not have that material base, that economic base that was basically a religious driven sort of industry, that you could have had the playtext. Ultimately.
I mean, it's a really, it's tricky because one of the things that's really challenging, right, is that England doesn't publish all the books that it sells, right? And so there are tons of books that are being imported from the continent, and we don't really know as much as we would like to know. We know that the books that were published in England, right? And we know the books that were published on the continent, at least lots of them, but we don't really know, so say I'm a bookseller and I publish some books. They might be books of poems, they might be sermons, they might be whatever, they might be all of the above, but it's not exactly clear where my money's coming from. It's not clear what my retail offerings look like. A lot of scholars in book history today, do a lot of work to say, like, oh, this publisher, and this is what the publisher put out. And it looks like this publisher has a specialization in X. And They do, because that's what they published. But in terms of actually understanding like what that represents of their business, that's much harder to do. Because, like, for example, most people don't realize that every bookseller in London sells rare book or sells used books too. And so, it's like, well, okay, well, what percentage of what they're selling are like used books, and like what kind of used books are they? Do they sell everything? Do they sell specific kinds of books? And so there's this kind of level of opacity actually about what we know about the retail experience, which is also how we don't really understand exactly what the business models of a lot of these guys are, or women are. We don't really know, because we have some inventories, for example, of some when people get sued or when they die, we have some booksellers' inventories, and they usually show that they have all kinds of weird stuff, and we don't quite know what their business looks like. Which is just to say that it does seem like there are booksellers. I mean, famously, right, Caxton, like the first book he publishes in England is Chaucer, at least the first kind of substantial book. And so literature is one of the things I want to try to emphasize, is that leisure reading is a major part of the book trade from the very beginning.
Okay.
I think it's because I certainly think that it's absolutely true that, look, like if you got the Bible patent, man, like you would want that Bible patent. If you got the Sternhold and Hopkins patent, you wanted that patent. You wanted also to be the guy who owns the rights to print the sermons of Henry Smith, right? The silver-tongued preacher Henry Smith, because those things were incredible bestsellers. You wanted those rights. And there are no equivalents for like patents of like bestsellers of literature, really, unless you kind of squint your eyes and turn Sternhold Hopkins into literature. Like you squint your eyes and turn, I don't know, something like The Temple into something that's not a religious book, right? It's not the same as a play, right? The William Herbert's The Temple.
Mm-hmm.
So it's true that you don't have like people like hankering after like what we think of now as like kind of capital L literature. As these sort of like bedrock things. But we do have publishers that seem to be specializing in literature and considering it a major part of their publishing stream from the very beginning. And drama is kind of fascinating in this respect, because it seems like publishers, you get early editions of Terence, right? Like who's Terence? He's the Roman poet who's like taught in schools. You get early translations of Terence in the kind of book versions, like the whole plays, and then you get like excerpts from Terence. And then you get these kind of Seneca translations that are kind of coming out. You get these Tudor interludes. But one of the things that it's not stationers really don't seem to know what the playbook is for in the early years. Mm-hmm. A lot of the earliest playbooks will say, like, 6 people can play this play. Here are all the other parts. And those scholars have looked at that and said, yes, the first playbooks are for performances. Because they literally say, this is how you would do it. You could double these guys, you double these characters. You could have like, if you have 6 people, your house can put it on. Mm-hmm. But one of the things, to get back to this kind of numbers issue, is that, okay, let's just say conservatively that like an edition of, I don't know, like Gammer Gurton's Needle, right? Or Lusty Juvenis, let's get a really religious play, like an interlude. Let's just say that the print runs 500 copies. And I think that's probably about right for like a mid-Tudor play. Okay. So 15, 16, 70s. Mm-hmm. There's no universe in which all 500 people who buy that playbook are thinking about performing it. Like, there's just no way. The numbers exceed the performance context. Like, not even if every big house in like England had a copy, like there are probably 500 big houses, but they're not all buying it. And so there's something that's interesting that the publishers of playbooks are kind of imagining a use case that the actual market performance of drama shows they've sort of misunderstood. They've artificially limited the market for the way that they've produced the book. So like, this is how you would play it. And scholars, I think, have sort of had this kind of interesting way of sort of thinking like, there was this period in which plays were published to be performed. And then there's this shift of like plays as the commercial theaters develop in the 1580s and 90s in particular. There's this sort of sense like, and then the playbook becomes a way to sort of imagine this theatrical climate that you either saw and then want to go back to, or you didn't see and you want to think about. So that's a very performance-oriented taxonomy, or a kind of like I don't know, like an ontology of the English playbook, right? A reception study of the English playbook, is that playbooks are for performance-y things. Because the books themselves seem to be interested in that, right? It's like you could put it on yourself, or like it was performed by the King's Men, or like it was performed in the Globe Theater. But one of the things that's just so remarkable is that like you've got all these playbooks that first off are selling 500 copies of an edition, and you're like, how, not everybody's performing that. And then you get further along and you've got all these people, a lot of the collectors we know who had the playbooks are people like in the provinces. I mean, maybe they came back to London sometimes for shows and to do London things. But we have this sort of weird world in which I think all the evidence from my perspective points to the realization, or points to the idea that people read plays as a narrative form. And they really are good at it in ways that we're not. And so in fact, like, honestly, like I'm not a performance guy. Like I get kind of uncomfortable in theaters. Like I'm not used to watching plays. It's just, they kind of creep me out. I'm not a drama guy.
What, reverse stage fright audience.
I get a little, yeah, it's like, I'm just socially, it's weird for me. And so I've really, what brought me to drama. So what brought me to kind of understanding the religious literature is like, okay, so like, how do you make a book that's as big as Fox's Book of Martyrs, this like famous compendium of English church history that's Protestant polemic? Like, how do you make a book that big? And so that was got me into the Reformation stuff. And then I was like, well, actually, like, okay, so I know how that got made, but that's kind of a big book, and it's sort of, I kind of know its audience already. But like, what's going on with Bibles? And so I'm thinking like, well, okay, so let's think about the Bibles. And so I've told you a little bit of my thinking about the Bibles. But then I'm like, well, this is what drives me about when an English literature scholar, ostensibly, the question that drives me is like, who, when, and why did people read this stuff? Like, so I'm interested in literature as a kind of social phenomenon. And I want to know what work literature does for people, right? I mean, if you get these I'm very inflected with the work of somebody like Pierre Bourdieu, somebody who's thinking about, a sociologist who's thinking about sort of the power work or the social work that engaging with art or culture does for you. So it's kind of, in some ways it's kind of limiting, right? Because I think literature certainly exceeds its social utility. But when we think about, the reception studies, just sort of like questions like, who owned playbooks? And like, what did they think they were doing with them? And like, why would you read a play when you could be reading these novels that are being produced in Spain or like in France? Or like something like, why do English writers stop writing weird stuff like the Arcadia or Euphues or these other prose fiction texts, these kind of things that are actually, even though they're impossible to read for modern audiences, they actually are more like a proto-novel than certainly a play is. But you have this sort of weird world that by the time you get into the late 16th century, it's very clear that people read plays and that publishers know that people read plays. And people then start collecting plays, and we've got lots of evidence of people collecting plays. And it sort of seems like to me that if we sort of think about the market and think actually less about the paratext in this instance, right? The paratext leads you to think like plays are for thinking about performance, playbooks are for thinking about performance. You just look at the numbers and the patterns of reception. It seems like people really just like reading plays for fiction. I mean, they like them for other reasons too. They like to think about the play they didn't see or the play they saw, but they're really, really good at thinking about plays as creating fictional worlds for us to imagine ourselves in. And we can still do that today, but I think it's actually not a literacy that we're well developed in. Like I don't think even when I read a play today, I'm much better at thinking about the stage business. That's how I'm trained. I'm less good about imagining Verona or like imagining like Troy or something. I'm less good at imagining a kind of fictional world that is fully populated by like individuals, not individuals in this kind of like 19th century novel sense, but like literal individual people that exist in this narrative world that I'm supposed to know something about maybe before I pick up the novel, or that has this sort of aspect of a broader fictional reality within it that I don't think we even really good critics today don't really think about the drama of the period as fulfilling a kind of major narrative role for people. And I think one of the work that I've done on English playbooks really suggests to me that for a large portion of the audiences of English plays, there's something that people are very good at reading for the story. And that I think is something kind of fascinating, because if we also too, I guess, and this is the last thing I'll say before I shut up, is that, we think about like, okay, so if I'm a kid and I'm a kid from an affluent enough family to have like gone to grammar school, I'm reading Seneca I'm reading Terence pretty early. We may be putting on plays at my school. So it's not as though there's necessarily like a priority of print over performance or reading over performance, but there's certainly a simultaneity. And so one of the things that this is kind of one of my hobby horses, is that drama as a market category exists from the very beginning of English printing. I mean, we have early plays from early 16th century. So not as early as early Caxton, but beginning of the 16th century. And we know that students are reading Seneca, they're reading Terence, they're reading all this stuff. And that's an experiential background that they have in addition to whatever experience they have with performance. Mm-hmm. And so the play world is actually one that the world of drama as a place that is imagining kind of interpersonal interaction and what might be, depending on the play, a more or less richly developed fictional space. That's something that people are really good at dealing with as readers in the period. And the work that I do on drama sort of tries to kind of operate from the beginning, where we actually see drama as a native print category rather than something that is always sort of struggling for surrogacy as this kind of surrogate role for like kind of standing in for performance or imagining future performance, but rather drama as something that has always been a sort of vital print or vital reading genre for folks.
Yeah, this is good. I'm going to try to bring about 5 boats into the harbor at the same time, and I hope
I'll be very impressed with you.
Yeah, but all right. So I go to see a production of Hamlet, and yes. And it goes fast. And something was in that speech that it was really good, and let's buy another ticket maybe, and go again and listen again, and. Then suddenly, I can get the play text, right? Sure. And I'm old enough to remember when you had to buy the CD or the vinyl album in order to get the lyrics to the song. Yeah. And there's some funny stories about what we thought was said. That's right. Excuse me while I kiss this guy.
Exactly.
Right. So it's the famous joke, and you go, oh wow, this is it. Okay, so you have the lyrics again, and it's a combination thing. Yes, you can sing the song. You can try to sing it yourself. You can, if you have your own little band, you can maybe perform it at a pub or a bar or something. Maybe get some people and do copy, that sort of thing. But it's not so. That's not that's not the main part of it. Most of us just wanted to hear, maybe sing along, and understand the performative elements of these things. But one of the reasons I think that you're kind of nervous about the performance element is that you deal with things that are physical objects.
Yes, that's right.
They stay in place unless they're destroyed, and the performance is gone. Right. So if I can tell you about a performance I saw back in the day when Glenda Jackson played Cleopatra, but there's only so much I can give you there. Right. Yeah, and I get frustrated nowadays about people who they're overly concerned about intellectual property or cultural property, whatever. Sure. And they have these great performances that are on DVD that you could distribute, you could put out there, but it's gone. And then it dies. A number of years go by and people forget about it, and people die off and so forth. And then it's just gone. And you say, no, don't do this, put it out there. And so I think probably what might make you nervous in a play is this is going right now as I see it. I can just see it evaporating, unless there is something afterwards that I can go to recreate this scene in my mind to make it preservable. And so that brings us to the world of me in my memory and my experience, my world of going to there's a joke, I think it's a Facebook joke or a meme or something. In my day, if you missed the movie, you never saw it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It was in the theater for 2-3 weeks. If you didn't go, you never saw the play ever, your whole life. And then we moved from that world. That's a movie. That is a film thing. That's that is a physical. You can replay it, but you just didn't have the way
you
to
didn't own it. You couldn't afford it. So,
right? Couldn't afford it. Didn't own it. So then suddenly VHS.
Oh man.
Go, I can practice that De Niro speech, I can practice doing that, with my buddies and that kind of thing, I mean, we're not going to be actors, but and replay it. I remember Raising Arizona. My roommate and I at that time must have watched it 200 times.
It's a
And
great movie.
we had it memorized. We had we had several movies memorized, usually with
Sure.
kind of spicy.
That's right. Exactly. Well, yeah, you got to be, what's the
kind of
point
thing.
of memorizing otherwise?
So the character of Frank Booth in Blue
Yes, of
Velvet.
course. Of course.
So, but we had no way of doing that before.
Sure.
You saw it, and there was, unless you had a super duper memory, you couldn't do it. So you have done work with VHS.
I do, yeah.
Let's talk about that with the Beinecke Library.
It's just Yale Library, yeah.
Yeah, out of Yale, and the what was that? Yeah, physical objects, VHS as artifact.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, so look, like you've sort of, my interest is in sort of how the artifacts of media that survive can give us a sense of like what people were up to and what they were interested in. And also, I think also, how it is that media change also generates different kinds of social phenomena. So, I think like, okay, so VHS collecting now that like the kids who grew up on VHS, the folks who like in elementary school and middle school and high school, had VHS in those kind of fundamental kind of coming of age things. There's a big nostalgia market for that now. So I was working with a friend of mine, David Gary, who is at the Yale University Library, the main library, not the Beinecke Rare Book Library. And this was kind of right as VHS collecting was kind of taking off. But a lot of folks now kind of around my age, sort of like, I don't know, in their 30s and 40s are really coming back to these things that provided these formative social experiences for them, right? They either like the spicy lyrics, or they saw something a little lewd, or this is what they watched at sleepover with Tommy, or whatever the hell it was. That that they want to. It's a kind of nostalgia collecting, but in that nostalgia is complicated and weird, and it's its own thing. But the fact is, as you were just suggesting, that the idea that you could go pick up a movie and see it again, or see it for the first time, or just say I want to see it, and then be able to follow through on that, that's a big deal. And I would say, I mean, yes, there is, yes, like there are some super rich people who had 16 mm projectors, and like maybe you saw like a movie at summer camp or something, or you like maybe the movie came through town, or maybe you are really, and this is cable television is kind of coming up right around the same time as home video. So the late 70s, or kind of second half of the 70s, are a big time for both of these things. But it was hard to see movies. And it was also hard, especially if you were in like the suburbs or something, it was increasingly hard. I mean, you have this problem too, where like there are a lot of smaller movie theaters. The smaller movie theaters are going out of business with the rise of home video. And so you have this kind of combination of it's actually being harder to see movies in the theater, especially smaller movies, especially genre movies. Mm-hmm. And it's also like, look, like you can see it on your own with your friends, and you can be loud, or you could watch something a little bit untoward, or I mean, look, like the beginning of any market is pornography, things like that, right? Like these are exercise videos eventually, but things that sort of depend on privacy that you might be kind of embarrassed about. Like home video just owns that world. And then, you have by like 1987, home video is making more than theatrical box office for most of the big studios. You've got, by that point, you've got people making movies, entirely new pieces of art just for distribution on video. I mean, think about home video is, the quality may be a little bit different, but like the Netflix era, right? Like that you can make these series and not have to worry about like a broadcast channel, like this kind of, and just streaming, and that people could subscribe directly to that. Like home video in the late 1970s, especially in the 80s, is, the predecessor of that kind of on-demand video. And so one of the things that's like, this is a major sort of feature of like kind of late 20th century life is the video. And, nobody's collecting this stuff. I mean, it used to be universities had big VHS collections because they could teach with them. And so it was a way to build a film studies program. And Betamax was super hot, and Betamax was big. And a lot of film scholars like stuck with their Betamax tapes of like whatever, like Battleship Potemkin or something until like the end came, and DVD and all that. But really universities just had them as like kind of crappy surrogates because they didn't necessarily have 35 mm prints or 16 mm prints to show their students. They weren't like a Yale or something. And so universities kind of completely deaccessioned that stuff with DVD. But then like now we've got this problem, right? Where all the VHS tapes, a lot of them are being thrown away, you know, they've been thrown away. You've got these kind of diehard nostalgia weirdos who are starting to collect them. But institutions don't have these resources available for students of the 20th century world to study. And in the same way that like my Bible stuff is interested in paratext, it's like, okay, so sure, you've got the new Blu-ray of a movie, you know, that was originally made in, say, Blue Velvet or something like that. So probably that Blu-ray has like the original trailer on it. It's probably got tons of interviews, tons of amazing new stuff. But like the language that was used to sell that VHS tape in 1985 or whenever the VHS tape kind of comes out, the actual product that was sold, the thing that you looked at the video store that like made you go, that's the movie for me. You know, that those artifacts are disappearing. And that if you wanted to tell like in the same way that like if you wanted to tell a reception history of the Bible, many people have done that. And my argument there is like you have to actually look at the books, and like you have to look at the books at scale to really understand what the trends were, or you don't really understand. If you're just reading the Bibles, you don't really understand the sort of trends. You don't really understand the sort of world that Bible reception is happening in. This sort of same argument I would make with the movie stuff. It's like, yes, we know all of the movies. We have a list, like here's all the movies that came out in like July of 1987, both box office and home video. Fine. But if you don't actually have the artifacts to study, you don't necessarily understand like how is this movie relating itself to that movie? You often get this movie's like, it's got a pull quote from some crappy review, and it's like, this is the new this, or like, if you liked Army of Darkness, you'll love this movie. And all that copy, all of like the weird box graphic art, all of that stuff is not necessarily traveling with the movie as it gets remediated into the modern world, right? Like when you go on Netflix, often like Netflix doesn't have the rights to the poster art even. So you've just got like a weird graphic that's like somebody made it in Photoshop yesterday. And so all of which is to say, like we've got this entire kind of massive chunk of late 20th century culture that literally is starting not to exist. The physical artifacts of it don't exist. And if we want to really tell the story of like, you know, what did middle income families in like suburban Ohio or wherever I'm from, you know, what kind of things were kind of they interested in, or like what was the media landscape of a kid that grew up in the Midwest in the 1980s who now is making new movies, right? So like we've got all of these. I mean, famously, somebody like Tarantino, right? Like Tarantino worked at a video store and he watched like all the weird stuff. But Tarantino is somebody who literally couldn't exist without the video store. I mean, yeah, he's rich now and he's got prints of everything. But, you know, you've got entire generations of art makers, even if you only care about art, in the production of art, like all of these influences are video store influences. And, you know, outside of some oral histories where somebody's like, man, when I saw that cover of that movie at the video store when I was 10, it like changed my life, man. Like you've got some of those in that kind of testimony. But without the artifacts, you don't really understand how to evaluate assessments like that. Like, did the movie actually look like that? Or is that a memory that's kind of misrepresented? You just don't have the raw data to be able to establish these chronologies or these kind of broader milieu, these media milieu for folks. And so I got involved in this kind of harebrained idea with my friend David Gary, who we were like, you know, Sterling Library had some extra money, and we found this collector in Dayton, Ohio that had a very good kind of genre video collection. And so we went there and bought it and got it shipped back. And it still is the only, I mean, it's kind of sad because I don't know really what's being done with it right now, but it is the only university collection of VHS acquired as a historical medium. So people have VHS. And so like when we published, like we were the first ones to do it. People were like, we've had VHS collections since the dawn of time, young sir. But they're not, these are not collections that were built for like the VHS equivalent of a book historian, right? Where a book historian wants to understand, like, where was this? Who owned it? Like, wait, was this owned by this rental store in Oklahoma? Like these kinds of things, right? The same things we'd ask, like, whose library was this playbook in? Nobody was collecting tapes, or still really is collecting tapes, as a kind of artifact that could give us some purchase on the reception of like one of the major media phenomena of, you know, our lifetime, really.
Well, there are paratexts in there too.
Yes, exactly. 100%.
Yeah. And so I'm triggering on any number of things that could be
Sure,
that
sure.
you're bringing up here, because that's what collections do. I mean, collections serve people with a billion interest, right? That are trying to make a billion points about this and that. But I think what you're talking about, some of those VHS tapes segued into DVDs, that segued into streaming, and you still have access to on Netflix, and some didn't make it. And it's
that's right. A lot of them didn't make it.
A lot, too many. Anyhow, so VHS, the object, I would imagine what you would do is you would digitize the VHS, so because it wears out after a certain amount of viewings, just like the book wears out after a certain amount of usages. So you could, but you still have the physical object there, and you can say this is well, that's it. It's the same thing as digitizing a text in order to preserve.
Sure.
The text. So you don't want a lot of people putting their fingers on that Gutenberg, and I don't want. I want to be able to do it myself,
Yeah, of course, right.
But I don't want millions of other people doing it, because that will destroy it eventually. So the other point I wanted to make was the Tarantino point. I'm in no way comparing Tarantino to Shakespeare, but there are a lot of comparisons that I can make in the sense that his movies, and a lot of other directors, but his is a very salient example of living in the video store and drawing from all of these sources in the movie and getting all of us into the audience. I'm of a certain age when I see Pulp Fiction. You're of a certain age when you see Pulp Fiction. And I'm getting it. I'm getting, there you go. Okay, well, those guys, of course, they're in black suits, and they're bad guys. We're automatically bad guys. And what was it? The blaxploitation flicks of the 70s and so forth. I'm old enough when the movie came out to have remembered going to see some of those, because there was a segregated town. I was in the South, but we would go to what was designated the Black Movie Theater, which had all the best movies.
Of course.
That's where the blaxploitation films were, and all the cool music there. And that was perfectly okay. There were no problems there. The problem was on the other side. When people wanted to, in segregation. But anyhow. Also, Bruce Lee. The martial arts stuff. Bruce Lee never played on the white side. It was all cowboy over there, and there was some great cowboy. But Bruce Lee and those movies, the kung fu movies and so forth, we just loved them. But after they were seen, they were gone, and then they made it into VHS. And then later on, of course, Tarantino sees them and goes, "Oh goodness, this is the best. I can make a curry out of this," And pretty much that's what Shakespeare does, but particularly in comedies. I have a student today who's I'm going to talk about sources for 12th night, and we get into all the various places where Shakespeare's drawing from. Well, of course, Ovid. Everybody did that, but all the way through for this, at least from the 60s through audiences who are hearing echoes of stuff that they had read and heard about on the streets in the drama. What I'm going to do after this is I'm going to make segments. It takes us a little time to get these produced.
That's fine.
So in long form, your segment will show up. So
take your time.
For people who don't have the time to sit and listen to you and I talk about the textual production in the 16th century or VHS, I think all of this is fascinating, but they can jump forward. But this would be the segment where we talk about, you are Ohio State undergrad, and I'm interested in this. You studied with prestigious scholars in prestigious institutions, of course, but the people are so good that if I were, knowing what I know now, if I were younger, your age, and even younger than you are now, and thinking, let's see, am I going to live, if I were visited by the angels, right? And it said, here are the people you get to study with, on a string of people from Alan Farmer to John King to, let's say, Hannibal Hamlin, we mentioned before, but you go from there to Yale Kasdan and
David Kasdan,
David Kasdan and Keith Wrightson. I was on a panel with them at a SAA conference about 10 years ago.
Oh, you were on that. You were in their their seminar.
Yeah, we were admonished by a scholar for being historical. How about that? Even in 2012, that sounded.
I remember that. I was at that. I think I was an auditor in both of those.
Okay, so we may have been
We've been in the same room.
We're
How
in the
about that?
same room. This is the way it goes. Anyhow, so that was so much fun, and what great people to have studied with. And I have appreciated Keith. There's a kind of funny story, I guess, we can be anecdotal. You at Shakespeare conferences, you and I know you go in there, and in my case, I had been to a Shakespeare conference, the SAA, for years. And so I walk in there and I'm going through and I see these people I haven't seen in years.
Sure.
Oh, I'm going to this talk. Well, we'll see you at the reception. We'll see you.
Right, exactly. Yeah. That's what it's for.
You walk in there and it's like a billion people in this ballroom in Boston. Right. I didn't see
it was Boston. That's right.
These people again. It's like, whoa, you see them on the highway and they're gone. And so I'm in one corner around a bunch of people I didn't know. And I'm going, well, I don't know what to do here. I'm going to go to the bar, have a drink. And there's Keith Wrightson.
Oh, Keith.
Yeah, he was looking around too, and he knew. We didn't know each other, but immediately
you made it happen, right?
We had plenty to talk about.
He's such a sweetheart. I love Keith.
Oh, he is wonderful. He is, and his work is absolutely very much cutting edge, even now. But in his time, he did what he and I can name a number of people. John King, of course, Martin Ingram, and. John, Kenny, just 100 people. I don't want to leave anybody out, but to go through OSU. Are you from Ohio originally? Or
yeah, man, I grew up in Columbus, so I just went to college like where I was from. I was born in a Rust Belt town called Lima, but
no need to do anything but walk down the street, go to college. You got to Ohio State. And that incredibly fine faculty at in the English department at OSU, and you found out you were a literary nerd. When did you find that? When was it that, oh no, I'm not going to be able to make a whole bunch of millions of dollars in business or go into what my grandmother wants me to, law or be a doctor or something that will impress the uncles and aunts at Thanksgiving. When did you realize that it was it was going to be a literary thing for you?
Yeah, I think, well, so like I, was a computer nerd when I was a kid. And I actually worked I'm of just the right age to have graduated high school, like right when the first .com boom was very boomy, like when it was too boomy, where it had to bust. And so I got hired as a network engineer, like when I was 17, like just out of high school, working for this like telecom company, and made a bunch of cash doing that. And then I was like, oh, this bomb is about to drop. Like this is all going to explode. And like my CEO is going to go to jail. And it's going to be bad. And so that literally happened. And so I decided to go to college, but I was going to be a biochemical engineer. So I was like hard science guy, because I didn't know like humanities. Like I just watched old movies and like whatever. And so I realized like I burned myself on acid, and I didn't like I like theoretical things. So I ended up pivoting, and this is so silly. My major was in philosophy. And so I did medieval and early modern philosophy and film studies actually in an English department. And then I had a women's studies minor through the kind of philosophy stuff. But what happened is, so I got really interested in like ideas, like any like too proud of himself, like guy in his late teens, early 20s, like I've got deep thoughts, man. And so I liked philosophy, but I realized that I thought that I might want to teach high school literature. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but I thought that in time. And so I had to take a Shakespeare class, because the pre-ed track at Ohio State like required that as this sort of thing. So I was like, okay, I'll take Shakespeare. Oh, I don't want to do this. It's going to make me miserable. There was a visiting assistant professor by the name of Alice Daly, who was there just fresh out of grad school. I think fresh out of grad school at UCLA. And she taught the Shakespeare course. Well, she happened to be a John Fox person. And so she ended up writing a book about martyrologies later down the line. But she was there for a year. And I took this like Shakespeare class, and I honestly don't remember much of the Shakespeare in it, but I remembered that because we had to talk about religion in the context of thinking about early modern literature, like you can't understand this stuff unless you're doing some religion stuff. And I realized that what had made me so excited about the philosophy that I had been studying was less the sort of propositional wrangling, although I kind of enjoyed that as a haughty 20-something or like 19-year-old or whatever. But I really was interested in like, what about, like, why do people care about this stuff? Like, what is the social implication? So it's this kind of always getting me back to this kind of question of like, why do people do the things they do? And how does it either serve them or alienate them from various communities? And so the religion stuff helped me think about these kind of like high level theological discussions that I was interested in, and sort of bringing them down to the sort of brass tacks of like living in society and interacting with people. And the literature provided me with a sort of weird, sort of almost like it's like you've got the religion, you've got these people that are interested in the social world, then you've got this other sort of cultural outlet. And I was interested in literature as a kind of repository of evidence for these kind of social phenomena. And so like I liked the literature because it helped me understand how at least some people thought about the religious world that they lived in, and how religion in particular had an impact on sort of people's relationship to a community or a society or whatever the hell that might be. That's a very Keith Wrightson kind of thing, right? Like society.
Yeah.
But so I sort of pivoted into the literature stuff because I was interested in the sort of these social questions about high level theoretical discussions. And then I got interested in the book. So then I took a 16th century survey with Alice Daly right after that. I was like, got one more semester in college. And then she introduced me to Fox there. And so I actually I didn't learn Fox from John originally, John King, even though like that's the obvious thing you would do. So I learned it from Alice Daly. And then I got interested in this sort of book history kind of phenomenon. So the books then provided me with a way to think about both religion and literature as a kind of social phenomenon, because books are kind of fundamentally social objects. And so that's my story about getting into literature.
Well, pardon me for asking if this is probing, but did you have a religious background? Anything that was?
Yeah, not really. I mean, so, it's like I've got like my parents were born in this like Rust Belt town called Lima, Ohio. Lima, but Lima because it's Ohio. We pronounce things differently up there. And we destroy, like the English destroy French words, we can, in American, can destroy all words.
Yes.
And so, I was born in Lima. My parents were from there. And so I grew up in a family where there were Christians and there were Catholics. And it's not because like they were particularly polemical about it. That's just like, that's how Protestant the sort of Midwest that they were in was. And so like religion was just sort of bedrock. And but particularly my father's family was very poor. And so like they very much have that sort of like Depression era kind of religion kind of background. But neither of my parents sort of really were super into it, but you could tell that they thought it was important socially to sort of like at least have it as a thing. Like, what else would you do? Like, you go to church. And it was very interesting to me because you could see that they thought it was something that you should be doing, but didn't really have the kind of propositional commitment to like any of it really. And I think maybe that's for me sort of what has always sort of made it a social thing for me, because I saw this sort of drive for them, particularly at raising a child, oh, we should probably make our kid, like, we should probably do this for the kid because that's what they did. Our parents did for us. And I think I was always kind of perplexed by this sort of weirdness of like them not really being into it, but feeling like they should. And it is, I guess maybe that's it. It's like this kind of sense that religion is something you do for social cohesion, but at a time in sort of 20th century America where like it was kind of optional at that point to actually believe in it. Like the world was secularizing in certain ways that like, kind of like, well, is this really what we need to be doing? And so I think, I actually come from a family that is not really that religious. And in fact, I think that's kind of what's interesting about it to me, because I've had this kind of a bit of an arm's length distance from religion my whole life, where I've seen it and understood what it does for people. But, like there was times like I was kind of a bad kid. And like, so like I was sent to youth group and stuff and like did some of that stuff. So I've also seen kind of social aspects of religion that I was kind of forced into in ways that were nothing like super, like I don't have like scary, like super weird stories. I have like socially awkward stories about religion. And so I've got this sort of kind of relationship to religion that has always sort of made me kind of want to understand like how it ticks, and like how people themselves sort of imagine their relationship to it. Like, what does it do for people? Because that's always been something, because like I think my parents kind of wanted it to do something even without a sort of strong propositional base behind it.
Yeah. And that sounds very familiar, even though I was coming along before you, very familiar. yeah, the thing is, in a smaller community, in smaller
Yeah.
towns and so forth, that the best way to integrate yourself into the community
Totally.
is to
Got to be in the church.
and they're usually Protestant churches in the areas that where
Yeah.
we were growing
Yeah.
up, not Catholic. And I think that's probably I'm with you there. That there's a sort of fascination in the sense that I was supposed to be learning all of this stuff along the way, that eventually I felt that I rejected, and
Sure.
then and then it was it's the 12th night thing. I had the Bible thrust upon me
Sure.
by my colleagues here, because I'm in Japan, and I'm not
Sure.
surrounded by Christians at all. And
Right.
you teach Shakespeare.
You're the one who's supposed to be able to teach. You're the guy who's supposed to be able to know this stuff.
Yeah,
man.
you're English in the King James Bible, you can do that, right? I go, well, I suppose so, yeah, but I'm, you're from the American South. That means you're a Christian and you're religious. So
duh.
I walked into this Bible class, and I was a complete idiot. I had to go down and read the Bible. I had to read the Bible, and I'm going, what?
This is wild. Yeah, this is a wild. This is a wild book.
And it's everybody, these polite women who would come from their little, I don't know what they were doing, the tea ceremony or something, but they would sit in my night class. I taught one at night also, when they're kimono, and there's just wonderful, polite women. And I'm going through week after week, and it's just death, destruction.
You're like in the book of Judges for all time. And you're like,
my goodness. And they're just wilting, right in front of me. And so where's the part where we get to live forever and all the happy stuff, And he goes, well, even that part.
We got Old Testament's really long, guys. It's really long.
Yeah. And how it's an example of how stupid I was. I put one Testament in one term and one Testament.
Of course. I've been there before, man.
It's idiotic. By the way, I'm doing Leviticus today, and I've finally figured out a way to get through Leviticus. I have a joke with my students. I said, the Bible just doesn't have a lot of video. Shakespeare, I can break off.
Yeah,
and, they're great in English, but it's still second language.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's hard work.
First language you wear down over a period, so we break it up.
Yes, you do.
And do it that way. But there's no. They weren't filming anything there with the Bible,
It's certainly not like Leviticus line by line, no.
Not Leviticus, no. Or the best you can kind of get is Charlton Heston or something.
Right, exactly, right.
Which to me is just hilarious, like the Vegas show that they have when Moses comes down from. It's wonderful stuff. But the thing is, so I say, listen, I worry year after year about actually boring someone. We talk about being bored to death.
Sure.
And that's a sort of idiom that they learn and they laugh about us. And I'm worried that I'm going to bore one of you to death one day.
Yeah.
At the end of class, one student's not moving.
Right.
Push you. And I said, Leviticus today is the one where you could easily get bored to death.
This is the endurance challenge, right?
I found a way to get through it pretty quickly and just say, listen, you got to have rules. If you're living out in the desert, you have to have rules. And these are a bunch of rules. And let's move on to something else. So,
well, and you can sort of sell it in terms of the sequel. Like when I had to, when I've taught parts of Leviticus, it's like there's got to be something that gets superseded here, man. Or at least for the Christians, but it is something that the New Testament is very remarkable when you realize it gets rid of all this, it gets rid of a lot of that. And it is something that it is kind of fascinating, I think, for me when this sort of supersessionism of Christianity is that it's like, wow, the book of Leviticus gets really short in terms of what you actually have to pay attention to all of a sudden. And so, it is this, I think the joke I made is sort of like yours, which is that hey, the New Testament gets you out of Leviticus. What a gift. It sort of saves you from large portions.
It does. It brings salvation in another way.
Yeah.
Well, what I want to do now is close the recording with the heartfelt thanks from me and from a lot of people you haven't met yet, but I see Japan in your future. And
I'd love to come. Yeah. You guys have a lot of early books that I need to see.
I have colleagues over here really in the Shakespeare Society, but also over at KO too. They would be interested in what you're doing. And you may be in contact afterwards. I may give you some names that you may already have actually. But thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Please. Thank you.